Hope everybody's doing all right. We're going to move on today, and I want to stand over here so I can see my slides. We're going to start looking at the various regions in Latin America. So far, we've been just talking in generalities about the overall patterns and trends, history, background, physical geography. But we'll still be coming back to some of those general themes and topics as we go from one area to another. And just to mention a few of the common themes, things that are going on throughout the region, say that physical geography continues to affect society and history. Features such as the high mountains of the Andes or the desert of the Atacama, tropical rainforest, all of these physical characteristics have an impact on what happens in the various areas of Latin America. Echoes of the colonial period reverberate to the present. There's still a lot of things in Latin America that reflect back to the period of the colonial involvement of the Spanish and the Portuguese in that region. Relationship between the indigenous population and the European descendants, the form of government, economic systems, those kinds of things. Political systems are slowly transitioning from despotic to democratic. At one time, most of the countries in Latin America would have been ruled by dictatorships, military in many cases. Today, that's unusual. Most of the countries have a semblance of democracy, and although it's in some cases not what you would call free democracy, example, Venezuela, but in most areas there are elections, there are constitutions and efforts to maintain some semblance of freedom of expression, freedom of the press. Populist socialist movements are strong in several countries, but in a few of them you're seeing a reversion back to more conservative forms of government. Case in point, Argentina, Brazil, up until a few years ago, were ruled by, quote, workers' parties, socialist-leaning governments. Today, those governments have trended back to a more conservative stance. Places like Bolivia, Ecuador, still very socialist in the governments. Many of the poor countries depend heavily on commodity export economies. That's probably true of most of the countries, period, not just the poorer ones, but even some of the bigger ones like Brazil, for example, are heavily dependent on commodities exports. Antagonism between the states and Latin American countries has diminished. If you go back to the time of the Reagan period or back further, then there was a lot of issues between the United States and Latin American countries. For various reasons, that's not as pronounced anymore. You have, for one thing, our focus has definitely shifted more to other parts of the world. We're more concerned about the Middle East, even Africa, Asia, than what's happening in Latin America. We're not as worried about the spread of Fidel Castro, communism, that kind of influence throughout the West as we were at one time. And as I mentioned some time back, populations are becoming more concentrated in the cities. So the whole character of society is changing throughout the region. No longer is this a region of peasant farmers, but today you find most people living in cities, urbanized areas. In terms of the economy, the middle class is growing, but you still find a very large poor segment of the population. Few individuals, families still control most of the land, most of the wealth. So you have this, most of the people have very little influence, very little wealth. Most of the money is in the hands of very few. Poverty segment is diminishing. Here's a graph, and you can see this is, and I won't bother, in fact, I don't even think I wrote it down, what the definition of actual poverty, indigence, which is a darker shading here, would be actual physical suffering, people being hungry without shelter at all. And you can see the trend has been down until the last few years where it's leveled off. There have been some reasons things have not gone as well in the last couple of years. And of course, this cuts off at 2014, and this is percent of the population within the whole region that meet those criteria. I want to just give you a brief sort of overall comparison between Latin America, and this, I have the data for Latin America and Caribbean. Caribbean component here is, I would say, at least numerically, not very significant. So just bear with me on that. But you can see that the population density is 32 people per square kilometer. And you can compare that to other regions of the world. Notice Asia, the highest, but population density is higher than North America or Oceania. And I'm not sure how that, I don't know if that's per land area or how they're measuring that. Notice that the population increase is relatively modest. At times, population increase in Latin America has been up in the range 3% or more, which is fairly high. Notice that Africa is still relatively high compared to the other areas. And this percent indicates how many people, what percentage of the total existing population is added each year. So if you have 100 people this year, the next year, with a 1% increase, you're going to have 101. And that means one more birth over death. And so you get that balance. And there are a few countries in the world, no major regions, but a few where you find actual negative growth, population decline. And notice Europe is fairly stable. It's almost completely stable. So the world land area, 148 million square kilometers, and that means that Latin America, the Caribbean, is 13.5% of the total world area. Population, 7.5 billion, and so that amount, 647 million, is 8.6% of the total world population. So the population density of Latin America as a whole is less than the average for the rest of the planet. Okay, today we're going to move on and talk about this area, Middle America, and just focus on this region, not try to be comprehensive, not try to tell you everything about this area, but just sort of give you a tour of some of the things you might see or experience within this part of the world. And that, of course, includes Mexico, a large country just south of the United States. Includes the various countries of Central America, from Guatemala all the way down through Panama. Now, in this course, simply for lack of time, I'm not going to talk about the Caribbean region, but that would include, of course, the Greater Antilles, areas like Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and, mixed background within that area. So we're going to just focus on Middle America, or Mexico, and Central America. And over here I can see better. Just looking at the physical regions briefly, you have a long peninsula that's an extension of the mountains in California. These coastal ranges actually stretch on further south. This is an example of what's often referred to as drowned topography. So it's like the whole continent just sank beneath the ocean. So what were valleys up to the north, the Central Valley, Joaquin Valley, Imperial Valley in California, here they just go underwater. So everything just kind of dips below the seas in this area. And so that's what the Baja region is. Playground for the rich, dry area, fishing. You have the northern deserts and mountains. Mountains flank either side of this region, and then deserts in the middle. Gulf Coast area, all the way really, including Texas, Louisiana, all the way around up to the Yucatan. You have an area here in the middle of Mexico that's very important. There's a range of volcanoes that stretches from west to east, right along through this area. And there are also important basin regions within this area. And the combination of these features, the mountains and these basins, the volcanoes, plus the fact that the climate here is moister than further to the north. This is desert up in the north, and here it gets wetter. Means that this is an attractive area. You have good soil. Volcanic soil is particularly fertile. You have, again, the climate, the water that makes growing crops available. And so throughout, long before the Europeans arrived, this was an attractive area to the various Indian groups. And so periodically you would have groups that would invade this area and conquer and replace other groups that were there before. So this was heavily populated long before the Europeans, long before the Aztecs who occupied this area. This was the most favorable area in Mexico. You have a southern mountainous area, Sierra Madre, and then the Yucatan, all of these different physiographic regions. This is mountains, this is flat limestone, not very far above sea level. And you have mountainous regions that stretch. Many of these volcanic stretch all the way down the southwestern side of Central America. So those are basically the physical areas or realms within this part of the world. Here's an old map. I looked up the date on it, and it's 1703, I think. And you can see it's a French map. You can see Mexico and New Spain. So this was all still Spanish. This is a map. It's interesting. It says 1810, but that's not 1810 because we got the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So this is about 1800. This is what Spanish, this was the maximum extent of Spain here in North America at that time. And Spain, of course, transferred this area to France, which immediately turned around and sold it to the United States. And over time, concessions, 1819, we get Florida, of course, the wars over Texas, and so very quickly then Spain and then later Mexico ended up relinquishing a lot of this territory. This is a little further on, 1860. You can see by that point, about half a century later, this northern boundary is pretty well defined between the United States and Mexico. And Central American countries by this time have broken apart. After the independence movement, the Central American areas formed a confederation, Central American Confederation. But there was never much hope that that would hold together. There were just too many differences, too many animosities, too much competition among the various areas here in Central America. And so they just split apart basically into the countries that you see down there today. All of them independent countries except British Honduras, which much more recently then gained its independence and became a separate country. So here another more recent map, 1897. Now you can see the various countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, British Honduras, which is Belize, Nicaragua, Honduras. Notice that this area down here, what was to become Panama, at this time was still part of the country of Colombia. That was not a separate country. That all had to do with the Panama Canal. We'll talk about in a little bit.
Why did El Salvador become such a tiny little enclave there by itself?
Charles, I'm not exactly sure, but it's a very dense concentration of people.
That seems to be where all the problems are.
Well, there have been a lot of problems between Honduras and El Salvador, and Nicaragua also at times. the fact that these are Central American countries, and we tend to sometimes lump these various countries into one basket, just think, well, Central America. What you fail to take into account is that there are strong feelings of nationality among these various areas. And that goes for, many parts of the world. Sometimes we sort of stereotype different regions, but the fact that they are separate countries indicates that they, at one time, and maybe even today, didn't care a whole lot for each other. So they had that difference.
And there's still areas where people don't speak Spanish. It's not universal.
So you're talking about indigenous languages?
Yes.
Yeah, sure, that's true, absolutely.
Because they're isolated populations. And
Yeah.
culturally separate.
Exactly. Okay, let's see. We'll start look at the various areas. Northern Mexico, I mentioned the Baja. This northern area, you have two mountain ranges. One of them, they're both called Sierra Madre. And the western Sierra Madre, eastern Sierra Madre. And so what you do is you come up from the eastern or the western lowland onto a high plateau. And the fact that this is a plateau, as well as overall global patterns, tend to create dry conditions here within this central plateau. A lot of times you get winds blowing either from the east or the west, and the mountains block the winds, and so you have the orographic effect of rainfall on the windward side of the mountain. So as the air comes up over the mountain, this area is wet. So there's forest and trees and all, but once you get into this interior region, it's fairly dry. You don't have a lot of moisture. And the same over here within the east. The area down along the coast, all the way down to Veracruz, is fairly damp, similar to the coastal areas of Texas. But once you get up into the interior, it's a dry region, flanked by these Sierra Madre areas. Probably the most important characteristic of this whole area up here to the north, most important feature, is its proximity to the United States. And so you have large numbers of people, not only the ones trying to get across illegally, but also you have a lot of people who go back and forth working on one side of the border or the other. A lot of commerce going on. This is the crossing point at Nuevo Laredo, and this is across from El Paso. So you can see the level of traffic. No, Juarez is across from El Paso. This is across from Laredo in Texas. Now another border town. See a lot of these things. This is a plant, an assembly plant. And I put a picture here of what they're making these headphones here. And this is one at Tijuana. These things are called maquiladoras. They are assembly plants, a lot of factories up in this northern area of Mexico, and obviously this is related to demand and commerce with the United States. And the North American Free Trade Agreement greatly enhanced this trade and this relationship, this economic connection between the two countries. So independent of what you think about this politically, it did bring a lot of people to this northern area and brought economic activity into this region. Basically what happens is manufacturing firms go across the border where they can take advantage of cheaper labor, take advantage of limited union involvement or organization, and that then allows them to produce things, assemble various kinds of items more cheaply than they could in the United States. So a lot of times the various components are shipped down to Mexico, you get the assembly work, and then the finished products shipped back to the United States. So these maquiladoras are very prominent within this area. It's the most important economic activity in this area of northern Mexico. Here's a picture of Monterrey, largest city in this northern area, and that's the chair of the mountain of the chair. Looks more like a grandfather mountain to me, but anyway. and dominates the landscape here in Monterey. It's a big city, a nice colonial architecture, except if you've been there, you notice this big monolith that they constructed in 1984, right in the middle, in the main park, right in front of you. You have all of this attractive old architecture, and then this, I think it's a monstrosity. I don't know what you think, but sticking up, out of the ground. And it's called the Lighthouse of Commerce. Well, within this northern area, this is what the interior looks like. Looking at, actually, took several pictures in through here. We were on a field trip. Geographers like to go on trips, and so we rented a bus in San Antonio, a lot of us, and decided we'd just travel by bus down to central Mexico and stop and look around along the way. And we rented it from this guy who had bought an old bus and refurbished it, and he was working with his son-in-law. And so we traveled through this area and again stopped along the way, and I just took pictures. This is at the base of the Sierra Madre. This would be the eastern Sierra Madre as we're going up to Saltillo in the desert. And you can see how dry it is. Had a flat tire along the way. And that's the father-in-law, and he's telling the son-in-law what to do down there it's about 100 degrees. And one thing I remember distinctly is while he was doing this, all of a sudden he jumped out from under the bus, cursing and yelling in Spanish. And well, there's a lavatory on the bus where you go to the bathroom, and the lavatory is nothing but a hole in the ground or a hole in the bottom of the bus. And some lady had needed to go, and she was, right above him, right at that particular time. So anyway, it's kind of a back mom and pop operation. Okay, went up to Saltillo. One thing I noticed there was so many shoe stores. They were all over the place. A lot of boots, a lot of walking through the desert, I guess. And just a few more pictures. It's very attractive, very pretty, and you'll see interesting things. For example, the trees up along the ridges, up on the higher elevations, and it's, again, a function of this orographic effect. You'll get winds that will condense moisture out of the air up at a higher level, but not at the lower levels. There's some local farmers. Here's another peasant. That's me. And in the middle of the day, very little going on, very little activity. You wonder what people do in that part of the world. Not much farming. There's some places set up along the highway where they are selling various things. And believe it or not, one of the things they sell and earn the most money from is the illegal poaching that they're doing. They're catching exotic lizards or snakes or things out in the desert, and they come here and sell it. It's completely illegal. And so as you pull up, sometimes they will just pack up and run back into the desert, worried that maybe you're one of the police or something. Took a picture of these little girls, rich little fat ones made out of corn. It must be some kind of little food item. But it did seem appropriate. They're pretty chubby, little girls, and they eat a lot of corn, I'm sure. So anyway, cute girls.
Sonny,
Yeah.
that first word on the second line is sandwich, but adapted for Spanish.
Yeah, that's right.
Our word is just
Without the D. Yeah. And sandwiches and salad, salada.
just tell for you.
Yeah. Now that's not, is that chicken? I don't, or is that a different word? What else could it be, right? Yeah, it should be double L, but yeah, so they must have just, I don't know what the V would be. Anyway, so All right, moving on into central Mexico. This is where most of the people in Mexico live, the largest cities. Second largest city, Guadalajara. Mexico City, of course, completely dominates this region. This would be, you remember I told you about the volcanoes and the good soil, all of that. Here's a picture of Guadalajara. San Luis Potosí, famous for all the churches in this area. We were there Sunday morning, and they were going to church. And they were not going to church. One thing that's noticeable in Mexico, and whenever I've been there, they like the color red. Moving on south, this is in Puebla. This is Popocatépetl, large volcano, active volcano in this region. Again, the good soil within this region. And you see much more fertility in the land. So you see a lot of farming, a lot of grain farming, a lot of irrigation, where they move the water from one field to another. And this goes back to the colonial period. Here's a famous aqueduct in Querétaro, and it's not functioning right now, but you know, in the days before enclosed pipe, to move water from one side of the valley to the other, you had to make it go across in a continuous grade or decline, and so this would be maybe not an open ditch, but you couldn't just go downhill and then back up the other side. This was some families living inside an ancient hacienda. They had the wall enclosing the area, and so they were living in there with their animals and everything inside the enclosure. This was the town of Dolores, famous for where some of the earliest movements of the revolution in Mexico began. And you see a lot of elaborate work on the churches in Mexico, again dating back to the colonial time. And a lot of work on the outside as well as on the inside. A lot of this gold leaf, which was created to praise God. Guanajuato was a major silver mining town. Not much silver today. A lot of the traffic is actually routed under the city. San Miguel de Allende is also a significant town in this. This is an important attraction to Americans. For some reason, there's a large group, a large colony of Americans who live here. And so there's a lot of outdoor marketing, the little booths set up through this whole area. You walk from one end to the other and then around the square on the other side. Pretty church, too. That's Allende, Mexico City, the largest dominant city in Mexico, obviously the capital, hit by an earthquake just the other day. Big sprawl, urban sprawl everywhere. So you often see the downtown area in the pictures, but this thing just goes on forever. And you can see evidence of the smog and the air pollution, all characteristic of cities like this. Pretty museum. There's the inside of it. And this is also what you see in Mexico City. Just, traffic jams all over the place. Hard to get around. Okay, let's move on. Yucatan is also part of Mexico, but it's an area that's completely different. Famous for its Mayan history and famous for the cenotes. This is limestone rock. And so what you have is underground, essentially melting of the limestone. It dissolves, and that carbonate eats away at the rock, and it creates underground cavities. In central Florida, it makes for sinkholes, and down here it creates these deep pools, and you can see you can walk down to it. Some areas. This is basically what the Yucatan looks like, just that. Reminds you of Florida, is what it does, except, the different types of houses and so on. And also, this is what you see in Yucatan. A lot of tourism. Cancun, Cozumel, major attractions for the cruise ships. The southern mountainous area, the three Sierra Madres in Mexico, Occidental, Oriental, and then the southern one. And it's an area that is heavily populated, but not really within the central band or the zone or the area of most favorable climate and soil. Acapulco is located here, of course, an important tourist site. And this is what the interior looks like. This is the Guerrero province in the south, probably most famous today for its poppy cultivation. We're getting a lot of illegal drug production in this area. And let's see. And a lot of it motivated by demand in the United States. Number of Americans reporting heroin use nearly tripled between 2007 2014. What seems to be happening is many of us in this part of the world will get hooked on prescription opioids and then discover that, well, once you're addicted, it's cheaper to go to the illegal market and acquire illegal heroin, and so that's, unfortunately, we have a real epidemic, and a lot of that is coming directly out of Mexico. Major areas of production is what's called the Golden Triangle, this area along the western side of the northern Sierra Madre, the western, but also this Guerrero province down here. This has become a real hotbed of this illegal trafficking. And here you see some police in the field. I guess they'll set it on fire, not sure, but notice how well armed they are. You'll find pitch battling taking place in these situations. 2005, Mexican farmers planted about 8,000 acres of poppies. Now you remember in the old days, most of this stuff would come from Pakistan, Afghanistan, that part of the world. But a lot of it today from Mexico, if not most. 2015, that was up to 69,000 acres, so huge increase in production. And equivalent of the DEA is operating. Here's a confiscation. And what's happening in Guerrero is, I've read about, they are unhappy with the official police. There's a lot of corruption within the police and graft and so on. And so there are vigilante groups to police and to try to control all of this illegal gang activity here within this area. I don't know how effective it is, but it seems to be something significant. Okay, let's move on. Talk about Guatemala a little bit. Famous for its monuments of the Mayas. Here's Tikal, perhaps the most famous. Here's a statue from Copan, also in Guatemala. Now you see, if you go down there, then you'll go to places like this, all cleaned up and grass is mowed and everything. Well, this is what it, looked like, and there's still a lot of places that look like this. Evidence of ancient civilization, but not restored. Antigua is the old capital of Guatemala. There are two major volcanoes at Antigua. One is Agua, that's this one, and the other is Fuego, fire, which is just off to the, I think it's off to the left. Both of them fairly active. So this is an area of tectonic activity, a lot of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions throughout most of this area. Here's downtown Antigua, and just out of school.
Sonny, when was the last eruption of one of those major volcanoes near us?
I think here in Antigua, here's evidence of well, this was earthquake evidence. There have been small eruptions, but I don't think anything in, I really don't want to say. I don't think anything from one of these volcanoes that has actually threatened the cities within this area. Now, there are other volcanoes, of course, that have, but I think these two have been fairly dormant in the last, but they're still considered active because, they have erupted within the last couple of centuries, that kind of situation. This is an old church that was torn up there. They've been trying to rebuild it. This is sort of, again, picture taken out of the window as we drove by one of these little villages, so you have some idea of what sort of the countryside looks like. beautiful spot in Guatemala is Lake Atitlan. It's an old caldera, volcanic caldera, and also a major tourist attraction. And of course, they'll sell you anything. One of the things about Guatemala that's attractive is the way the people dress. Not only the women, but also the men, with beautiful outfits that actually identify what particular group they belong to. And so you can, different parts of the country, you can tell, one group from another. It changes, and very attractive fabric. Another important tourist site, Chichicastenango. And again, you just walk all over the town, and there are all of these places where they're selling different things. The main attraction, this is an area of pilgrimage, not only for gringos, but also for local populations who come. And you can see all of this is wax from candles that have been lit here on the steps of this church. And you can go in and light candles as well. But I wanted to show you that we were down here with a group from Alabama. That's Jack Hawkins. If you don't, that's this guy right here. If you don't know who Jack Hawkins is, there's a picture of him. At this time, he had just become chancellor at Troy University, and he's still chancellor at Troy. That was about 30 years ago, and sometimes mentioned for governor of Alabama. So, nice guy. Guatemala City, the biggest city, also frequently hit by earthquakes. Here's El Salvador. Notice the population density, the difference between El Salvador and some of the other countries here. Many more people, a lot of people, especially along the coast, southwest coast. Coffee is a big item in El Salvador, commercially, and a lot of the land has been pretty well cut over. So you don't see much in the way of woods forests. Looks somewhat like Haiti. If you've been to Haiti, you know that the devastation of the vegetation is a result of the overuse, the overcultivation. Coffee, subsistence agriculture, not as much of the bananas, some of the other commercial crops that you find in other parts of Central America. And of course, San Salvador, capital of El Salvador, is sometimes called the murder capital of the world. Very violent place. Honduras, relatively poor country. And you can see the capital, Tegucigalpa, in the middle. This is what a lot of Honduras looks like. Again, typical of many areas in Central and even South America. Large city of Tegucigalpa. Hurricane Mitch devastated Honduras back in 1998. Killed over 9,000 people. And in some areas, they're still recovering from that. Nicaragua, major area, again, volcanic activity. These lakes are essentially caldera from ancient volcanoes, Nicaragua and Managua. Managua is the capital city. This area over here to the east is what used to be called Mosquito Coast. It was the area where the British were involved at one time. Largest city.
10 minutes. Gracias. There's only one road crossing into Nicaragua, and this river crossing, which has recently opened. During the years of conflict, it was virtually impossible to use this method to cross the borders, but nowadays things are a lot more relaxed. Hola, señor. ¿Cómo estás? There is a scheduled boat across the border every other day, but your best bet are the local fishermen. Up the river and into the heart of darkness. We're crossing into Nicaraguan territory now. What a border! Well, this is different. Nicaraguan passport control. Hola. I have my passport. Don't laugh at the photograph. Nicaragua has seen years of political upheaval and conflict. 40 years of the Somoza dictatorship spurred the Sandinista revolution, which was followed by the American-backed Contra War. But the democratic elections in 1990 have finally brought peace to this country. The journey down the Rio San Juan will take you to the historic town of El Castillo. El Castillo is the only castle in Central America and was built by the Spanish in the 17th century to defend Grenada from British, French and Dutch pirates. In 1780, the British, led by Lord Nelson, captured the castle and their flag flew here, but only for a few days because the Spanish kicked them straight back out. El Castillo has seen its share of visitors, but it's still a remote place. And if you want to explore the surrounding jungle, you can find a guide in the town.
My name's Neil.
Oh, Juan Carlos.
Juan Carlos.
Okay, Neil. If you want to use the bathroom, here's your chance. We have a long journey up ahead.
Okay.
Watch for your balance in there.
Thanks.
That's the bathroom.
During the Contra War, this area was totally off limits, but nowadays, so long as you can paddle, there's plenty of wild jungle to explore. Dogs are bailing out. What do you think they've spotted?
It might have been one of those big rodents. It's called the Watusa.
Watusa. That's what these dogs are used for, is it, hunting Watusa?
Yeah, basically they're expert in trying to catch a Watusa.
What was it like here during the war, Juan?
Well, it was a complete different situation. The only way you could come to these places was with a weapon, because there was a lot of fighting going on here between the Sandinista army and the Contra forces. I think we should take a rest about here and cut this water tree. Some very good water. This is like bottled water. You're gonna have to carry this. This will be our water supply for the rest of the day. Okay? Let me get some of this too. A little bit.
Nice. Refreshing. And the answer, an optional extra. Well, you better stick it in your pocket and we'll get trekking then.
All right, we'll stick it in your backpack better.
No, you carry it.
Well, they go into Watusa, but you don't want to see that. It's not very pretty.
In the region around El Castillo, you can travel by boat across Lake Nicaragua. There are 400 islands in the lake, and some of the most isolated are in the Solotanami archipelago. Lake Nicaragua is the largest lake in Central America, and it's the only freshwater lake in the world where sharks reproduce. Legend has it that the Indians used to sacrifice their dead by dragging the corpses in the water until the bones have been picked clean by the sharks. Nice. There's 36 islands in the Solotanami archipelago, and this is the largest, Mancaron. And it's also the only one with a hotel. Better go and check in. The Solotanami Islands played a crucial role in the Sandinista uprising against the oppressive Somoza regime. Apparently, the owner of this hotel played a role in the revolution too.
Hicimos la toma al cuartel de San Carlos, una toma muy importante porque
we attacked and captured Somoza's guards at San Carlos Fortress.
La guardia de Somoza en su propia casa y que hicimos una.
We started a great revolution that taught us a lot about human solidarity.
¿Qué es esto?
Esta es la bandera rojinegra.
This is the red and black flag that was the symbol of the fight of the Sandinista front. With the success of the revolution, we overthrew a 50-year dictatorship.
It's Sunday afternoon.
Okay, let's take a quick break and come back quick because I got a lot more to tell you. Okay, let's get back. All right, some more pictures. Managua was hit by a major earthquake in 72. You could go up and down Central America, and most of the cities, most of the areas, at one time or another have been stricken by earthquakes. Nothing unusual. Costa Rica is an interesting country in many respects, different from other areas within Central America. For one thing, Costa Rica has had a fairly stable political system since the beginning. They really don't have an official military. They don't have an army. They have a police force. And so things in Costa Rica have been politically much more stable, less differences, less political and social problems than many of the other countries. San Jose, pretty steady, interesting. I just put a picture of these mystery stones. Honestly, I don't know any more about them other than they're very old. Evidence of ancient civilization here within this area. This was at the last election, and they are, advocating for their political party. But again, elections take place regularly, and they don't have many of the problems that you find in other Central American countries. Driving through there, I thought it was interesting. They put this blue bags around the bananas, and why do they do that? These are banana trees. These are banana bunches, and so when they get ripe, I guess they're not fully ripe, but just before they pick them,
It would probably slow the ripening and keep them on insects.
Yeah. I wonder if they put some kind of chemical in there to enhance the ripe or retard it or something. Anyway, all you people can figure that out. I told you that we periodically, Bob and I have been on this cruise ship as a lecturer, and we got on the ship here at Limon, which is along the east coast or the Caribbean side of Costa Rica, and it's a banana loading. That's what they do, is they load bananas. You have these trucks that come in round the clock, day and night, bringing bunches of bananas. Ships would pull in within a couple of hours. They'd be loaded and off. And so one ship after another. You go to bed at night, you wake up the next morning, and it would be completely different vessels there getting loaded up with bananas, all destined for markets here in the United States. And then there's Panama. Panama has a unique and interesting history. We had an Institute for Latin American Studies here at Auburn, and I was involved with that for a long time. And periodically we would go down. We had various activities associated. These are faculty members at the University of Panama, and so we were out doing some survey activity around Lake Gatun. We interacted with some of the indigenous groups. These are the Waimea Indians up in the northwestern area. They were having some issues with local cattle people. But the main thing in Panama, in fact, one of the things we were down there was looking at environmental issues associated with the canal and development of areas along the canal. One thing that's happened with the Panama Canal is that there is severe erosion along the Chagres River and into Lake Gatun, and that's detrimental to the canal because you have silt deposits building up, so all of that residue or all of that sediments building up, and it tends to reduce the effectiveness of the operation of the canal. And so the idea was to develop some ecotourist sites and do some things to try to stabilize the environment within the canal area. But notice that the canal, as you go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you actually go from west to east. There's a crook in the land here, and you go kind of opposite of what you might expect. I mentioned this palindrome. There are major features in the canal, and you come in from the north. There are three lock systems. One is Gatun, and that's where the dam is. The lake here, the Gatun Lake, is actually a reservoir. They've dammed up the Chagres River, and this lake reservoir serves as a supply of water that is used to operate the canal. So you come in the first set of locks, again coming from the Atlantic side, travel through the lake, and then you go through, this would be the higher mountainous areas, go through what is called the Gaillard Cut, named after an engineer, and used to be called the Culebra Cut. And then you go through another set of locks, the Pedro Miguel and the Miraflores locks, before you go down to the Pacific Ocean. So basically the ship, through this lock system, is raised. The lake is at a higher level than the surrounding ocean, so you're raised up to the lake, and then the other two lock systems lower you back down to the Pacific side. So that's what the locks do. And here is the Gaillard Cut, and you can see the passage through the mountain. This was the most difficult part of the trip. You see a few more pictures. Gatun Dam.
Sonny, what is very interesting, you know, what I've read, they still use the original locks, the doors, or the, I don't know
Yeah.
what you call it, maybe it's not called the door.
Uh-huh.
The way the system, you know, how it works. It's over 100 years old, it's pretty amazing.
It is, and
And now, of course, they have built a new Panama Canal right next to it for the super.
right.
ships,
Yeah, I'll show you a few pictures of that, just a minute. And so here's this is the Miraflores lock, I think. Or maybe it's Gatun, I don't remember. Okay, so this is the way it works. You go up through a series of locks into the lake level, and then again down on the other side. I'll put all of this online so you can look at all this information at some point. Everything is gravity fed. And so the water from the river flows into the lake, and as the ships go through, then gravity is used to fill or empty the locks. And so eventually the water runs out to the sea, but there's enough river flow to maintain the lake level, or there has been. Now with the new locks, there's some concerns about that, and that was also one of the concerns with regard to sedimentation. Interesting book, and most of what I know about the Panama Canal comes from this book, written by David McCullough. So if you haven't read it, go home and read it this afternoon. It's about 800 pages, I think. Okay, well, obviously the Panama Canal, important because it blocks passage from one ocean to another, and that has been a handicap. It's been a problem for centuries. So up until the 20th century, you had to go all the way around the southern tip of South America to get from one ocean to another, and of course, especially during the time of sailing vessels, that was not very convenient. Columbus sailed across, he explored the coast of Panama. Balboa, within the same area, quote, discovers the Pacific Ocean, although it's pretty good evidence that some other people knew about it earlier. They called it the Southern Ocean, the South Sea. This had an important connection to Panama. This is the mountain of Potosí in Bolivia. And again, I mentioned this before, a mountain of silver, major deposits in this area. So they would ship the silver from the mountains down to the coast aboard ships. This is during the colonial period. Silver would go up to Panama. They would transship it across the isthmus on the backs of mules, and then again on additional boats. The fleet would form up, go up, pick up more silver at Veracruz, and then head off across the Atlantic. And this is La Vieja in Panama, is where is the old city where all of this would take place back during the colonial period. That's north of Panama City. And here is some of the actual trail of the mule trail that was used to transport the silver across the isthmus, Las Cruces. Important for the United States, this blockage of passage was, we wanted, especially as people began to go to the West Coast, to go mine gold in California. Well, you had to go all the way around South America, but you could cross over on the lakes in Nicaragua aboard a steamship. and that was an attraction. The French decided that they could do anything at that time. This is in the 1800s. This fella, de Lesseps, had just built the Suez Canal, and so the French, he established a company to build a canal across Panama. He had built the Suez Canal. There's the Suez Canal, and it's, of course, still in operation in Egypt. The Americans, by this time, in the mid-1800s, had built a railroad from one side to another, so you could travel by train, but it was difficult to maintain, and it cost a lot of lives to build this railroad, and it was not really very efficient or very effective. And so there was really a need or a desire to build a canal. So de Lesseps set up a company, and they began to work in 1880. Big challenges, both malaria and yellow fever, two different mosquitoes, killed many people. The French were determined to build a sea level canal, so they wanted to just cut out all the dirt and make it, just as they had at the Suez, make it from one ocean to another. But it turned out to be a much bigger project than they had anticipated. They ran out of money, there was corruption, and by 1891 the company liquidated. Again, the corruption brought people to trial, and one of the people caught in this business was Gustave Eiffel, the builder of the Eiffel Tower. And so his reputation took a hit as a result of all of this, because he was part of that. The United States took up the ball. We had an interest in this because we could very easily benefit from a canal, and there were 5 routes considered, and you can see I've drawn them on a map here. Probably the one that would have been cheapest to build was this one through Nicaragua. In other words, a series of locks up to the big lakes, Nicaragua, Managua, and then down the west side. But at this time, and another factor here, at this time, Panama was owned or was part of the country of Colombia. And there had been a lease agreement between Colombia and France, and there were political issues with the United States wanting to take over that lease. They wanted to charge us more than we wanted to pay. And this fellow got mixed up in the middle of it. He held stock in the French company, defunct French company. He wanted the United States to buy up the rights to build the canal through Panama. And so he finagled. He had contacts in Washington in the United States. He finagled to make that happen. He lobbied actively, and one of the most interesting aspects of this, he placed an envelope on the desk of every senator in the United States government with this stamp on it to emphasize the fact that Nicaragua was dangerous, because after all, look at the volcanoes. The envelopes had this stamp, and so it was notable. He managed through this and other devices to get the United States to approve an effort to build the canal in Panama rather than somewhere else. And in order to do that, you had to gain access to the canal. And so negotiations broke down between the United States and Colombia. Well, that's where Federico Boyd comes into the picture. He was a Panamanian revolutionary, and so the United States immediately went to bat, went to support the, quote, revolution that was just a bare uprising, but with our help and our big gunboat was successful, and Panama then gains its independence from Colombia, and we immediately turn around and sign a treaty with the new government of Panama to build the canal. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt was the president at that time, and he had he was a big advocate of the idea of the manifest destiny of the United States, that we have a right to all of this stuff. Okay, so anyway, here's some old pictures of the construction. This doctor was very important because he was the person who was finally able to bring yellow fever under control. He was a native of Alabama, born down near Mobile, and ended up then realizing that the yellow fever was transmitted by this particular insect, which is well adjusted to living in human environments. And so his major undertaking was to control the environment of the mosquitoes, pots of water and all those kinds of things. Here is his fumigation team going out around Panama to get rid of all of the habitats for the mosquitoes, because this disease killed hundreds and hundreds of people, and thus reduced the labor capacity of any enterprise trying to construct a canal. Had these screens that were prevented. Under the French, they did things like, to keep ants from getting in your bed, they would stick the posts, the legs of the bed, in pots of water. And that's about the worst thing you can do in terms of trying to, if you're worried, in terms of breeding mosquitoes. And so they realized that and did away with that. This fellow took over construction of the canal. He was a railroad engineer. One of the points that sometimes is missed is that the construction of the canal was really a railroad project. Not so much the digging, but it was hauling off all of this waste dirt. And what they would do would be carry it off to the coast and then pile it and create breakwaters. And if you go to Panama today, you can see large areas where all this material was dumped. So it was managing the railroads was actually more important than the excavation. Brought in workers from the Far East, also from the Caribbean. Here they are, just a series of old pictures. This is Teddy Roosevelt riding the train down, looking things over. Here he is on one of these big Bucyrus excavators built in Ohio, I think. There were several of these. And so the digging took place. Took 10 years. They started in the United States, started in 1904 and completed in 1914. Eventually, Goethals took over, military guy, constructed. Here they are going through the Culebra Cut. Various pictures, and eventually got around to building the locks. The engineering is ingenious. Again, the movement of the water can generate electricity, but the actual floating of the vessels, moving the water through the locks, is completely gravity fed. So all you do is open and close valves appropriately, and you can move the ships along. So it was an amazing bit of ingenuity, and still in operation today. It's still going strong. Building the big lock doors. That's what you were talking about. Again, still in operation.
It's been called one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. A man-made waterway, 50 miles long, that forever altered the face of the earth.
The Panama Canal exceeded any country's capacity. If in 1904 you asked me to put money, I would have said, no, it cannot be built. Nobody knew how this was going to be done.
The geographic location of Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, has always been coveted as a way of making the oceans meet. With the building of the Panama Canal, the realization of a dream became an expression of the power, the strength, the might of a growing nation.
For nearly 100 years, the Panama Canal has stood for the triumph of technology over nature. But when it was built at the dawn of the 20th century, it was simply an audacious gamble, a colossal engineering project, the likes of which the world had never seen.
It's a story of inspiration. It's a story of humanity. What man can endure with the pick and shovel to dig the canal.
It used science and engineering and government to improve the country and really improve the world. But it has a dark side as well. It is also a symbol of arrogance, authority, and power.
The canal really announced the United States as the leading country in the world. It demonstrated an extraordinary will and determination. They had succeeded in conquering nature as no one had ever done before.
So that was just a preview of a program that was coming on PBS. Okay, well, finally completed in 1914, right at the time of the outbreak of the First World War, so it really got little notice when it was finally done. But continued problems with these areas where periodically it would be closed because you would get sloughing off of the land and the rock into the canal, and it would have to be dredged out. And finally, I think this was the first passage through the canal at that time as a ship made it through. During the Second World War, of course, it proved to be important. The width of the canal barely could accommodate our big battleships. And so the width of the canal has been a limitation, well, or was a limitation for a long time on the construction of ships. And so you have Panama-capable ships and ships that are not Panama, I forget what the term is. So the big super tankers obviously can't go through the canal, but if you're transporting petroleum from Saudi Arabia to ports in Texas, you don't need to go through the canal. And this was a passage of a replica of one of Columbus's ships. Of course, you're familiar, we gave it away with the 1977 treaties, Jimmy Carter. I say that facetiously because we never really owned it. What we had was a lease, and it said it was a 100-year or 99-year lease, but it could be renewed in perpetuity, but we never really owned the canal. And it was really in our interest to go ahead and let the Panamanians, they were doing a lot of the management anyway. And by this time, 1977, the canal no longer had major strategic value to the United States. We have plenty of naval ships in both seas, and so that naval power requirement has been greatly diminished. Warfare is done differently from the way it used to be done. We don't need big battleships anymore. And so that transition took place, and today then the canal is completely run and managed by the Panamanians. Okay, well here's a diagram showing some of the areas of improvement. New locks up here at Gatun, as well as San Miguel Miraflores, to accommodate larger vessels, deepening of the channel here and there. So major improvements. Here is let's see which one. This is Gatun coming in from the Atlantic. And so you have a new channel that's been cut that will accommodate the larger ships. And this is on the Pacific side at Miraflores. And here you see all of this opened up in 2016, and it does accommodate the larger ships. You can see the old channel over here, and it's still in operation. These pools are water-saving pools, so instead of just letting the water run out to the sea now, they're trying to conserve the water because with the bigger locks and so on, they don't have enough water just from the natural flow and the rainfall. And so that's one of the accommodations that was made with the new improvements. As I mentioned, Bob and I were fortunate to travel on this ship, driving around, and so when we started to go through the Panama Canal, we get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they're fairly wealthy people on this ship, so they have hors d'oeuvres and all kinds of things, you know, as you traverse and up there looking at the passage through the canal. And they let you roam around on the bridge. I'm sorry, what?
And they include you in Auburn, having the hors d'oeuvres.
Oh, absolutely. We did all of this. In fact, I spent a lot of time up here on the bridge talking to the captain and the pilot. He's taking us through. And here we go. It was interesting. One thing that I noticed, you know, they attach lines, cables to the ship and pull it through. The ship doesn't power itself through the canal, but these little engines are called mules. They pull you along. Well, how do they get that ship? Well, the first thing that happens when the ship pulls up to the lock, here comes a little fellow in a rowboat paddling out. And so they throw the line down, you know, a small line and then that bigger line. And so I asked him, I said, well, why don't you at least use a motorboat? You know, why are you paddling? He said they tried motorboats, but given the wet climate and the problems with getting parts and all that, it's a whole lot cheaper and easier just to paddle out there and do that. So high technology, but also low technology when it's needed. There's one of the mules, big ships constantly coming through. And during half the day, the ships go in one direction, and then half the day they go in the opposite direction. So, you know, you're not running into each other. Well, there I am relaxing as we go through.
They use the old locks now, too?
Yeah, they still use the old ones, but they've added the new ones. And these big...
After dark, do they continue to run?
Somewhat, but I don't think they go all night. I don't know. Some of you may know more of that. And I got here were some folks in a kayak going through. I don't know how much they paid. You know, you pay by your tonnage. The bigger the ship, so they probably didn't pay very much.
So what would be the toll for one of those super tankers?
I think a big cruise ship like that was something like $50,000-$70,000. And I don't know, one of these, I don't know if it was that much or not.
Also, you have a waiting line. You're like many times you have to do waiting events.
Yeah, that's right, you have to wait.
Because you see people in boats, there are ships, they're waiting.
That's right, on both ends you have large numbers of ships just sitting and waiting their turn to go through. Okay, and here's a new bridge. That was built in the 90s maybe, 80s or 90s. And here are the docks at Miraflores. This is going into the Pacific. And a lot of tourists, and I've been up there and done this a few times too, watch the ships go through. It's really fascinating. You know, the ship comes in low and then goes up high or the other way. And here we are crossing into the Pacific, Panama. Okay, that's it for today. And we'll move on to South America next time.